Hi, scholars. Today we are looking at two chapters from our African American Studies textbook. Specifically, we're going to have a lecture on Chapter 8, Revisiting White Privilege, Pedagogy in Black Studies. That is on page 99. And then we actually skip to Chapter 10 on page 126. And that is Africana Studies and Oral History, a Critical Assessment. And I'm probably going to combine both of these lectures in this one video, but I will have a time index for you. So if you want to jump to a different chapter to listen to the lecture, you will be able to easily do that. Starting with Chapter 8 on page 99. So this is a really big chapter and big topic, and it can often be an uncomfortable topic for some people to talk about white privilege because it ends up feeling more like individual blaming and not being able to control racially if you look white. So, for instance, I'm not white, I'm biracial, but I have white privilege because I look white. So what does that mean, and what is my responsibility regarding white privilege? And I think that the authors for this chapter, Tim Davidson and Jeanette R. Davidson, they do a really good job of discussing and centering Africana studies and Afrocentricity and changing maybe the way we approach the idea of white privilege. And they center right at the beginning W.E.B. Du Bois again. And we've read now a little bit about his contributions to African American studies and Black studies. And I think that it's really important to highlight what is discussed on page 100 in the second paragraph. And it's the first full paragraph of that page. It says, white privilege needs to be examined from an Afrocentric perspective. Otherwise, critiques of white privilege become almost exclusively centered in whiteness, sometimes with too much glorification of an author's mea culpa and generally without enough first-person insights into Black people's experiences, even if a critical lens is utilized. So the key that they are saying in regarding to how you talk about white privilege is actually from a Black perspective and from Black lives and Black experiences. And again, in that same paragraph, is discussed that peoples of African descent and Africans and African Americans have agency, and they should be studied and understood as subjects rather than objects of history. And that's from Asante, who we have also read some of within some of the chapters here as a very important Black scholar to the field. And so I do think that it's important that we're not marginalizing the Black experience. And even here, it talks a little bit about disorientation and decentering. And so I think that's really important because if you continue reading in this chapter on page 101, they talk about all the techniques in which white privilege is used systemically to try to take away freedoms and rights of people of color and Black communities. And the ones that they mentioned here on page 101 were seeing happening today. You know, the voting rights and the gerrymandering that's occurring and the suppression of voting inequitable prison sentences based on racial biases, the real estate issues in terms of redlining and who has access to which homes in which areas. Um, and then, of course, the relatively poor health and experiences that happened during this COVID-19 global pandemic, which is also discussed on page 101. And so this surpasses an individual responsibility in terms of our one-on-one interactions with others. And it's more about a system that privileges a community or a certain group that looks a certain way. And how do we dismantle those privileges and make our society more equitable for all people? And the first step is, of course, acknowledging that there is an issue, that there is systemic racism. And if we can't get to that point, it makes it extremely difficult to dismantle and change the situation. And so the authors continue, they discuss W.E.B. Du Bois's veil and double consciousness starting on page 101. We have spoken a little bit already about what double consciousness means in previous lectures and in previous readings. And I think that the key is that two-ness. So a distorted view in terms of how a white community might view a Black individual. And the authors provide this really good example from Du Bois's own life, in which he lived a relatively privileged existence and came from a family with means, and yet he was still snubbed by elementary school classmate, and what that experience did to him psychologically. And so that's one side of the double consciousness. And then the other side is your own first person view of your Black identity and your Black experiences as a genuine human being, as they describe here at the bottom of 102. And so that experience is reiterated again in this chapter, and the amount of extra labor and work and the resilience that members of the Black community have to go through in order to access the same rights and privileges as others in the community. And that's described at the top of page 103. And so, they talk about higher education, voting rights and representation, skills training, freedom of mind. So part of what you should be considering as you're moving through this chapter is the system itself. And so they get into that system at the bottom of page 103 with the myth of meritocracy, white fragility, unearned assets, and white obliviousness. So meritocracy is the idea or the illusion that those who succeed and are successful are the best people. And so obviously anyone who doesn't get the job that they wanted or get the career that they wanted, well, they are to blame. So there was something lacking about them that prevented change. But that's a myth. And if you just consider yourself or even your life and your friends or your family, I guarantee that you can name someone or think of someone that worked extremely hard their entire life, and yet the outcome of all that labor and all that work never merited what they deserved. They were always passed up for that promotion, or were unable to pass a class, and so a degree wasn't earned. What happened that caused those obstacles? So that's the question that you might want to consider when you're thinking about your own experiences. So I can consider my grandparents and the fact that they didn't complete grade school, let alone high school, and didn't get their diplomas. And yet they were the hardest working people I'd ever seen. And they encountered extreme forms of Mexican racism and where they were living in Texas, and the reason why they had to drop out of school, and what was, happening to my family in that time period, right? And so understanding that meritocracy is a lie, it's a myth. It's something that's supposed to placate individuals so we don't feel bad that a system is set up that doesn't allow everyone equal access to education, or equal access to health, or equal access to food and shelter. The other topic that's discussed in that section on page 103, and it goes on to 104, is that white fragility that I mentioned. And so there's a response in which, when you talk about white privilege, a white audience could get very personalized, feeling like you're talking about me. This is you're blaming me for all your problems and your hardships. And so there can be triggered emotions like anger, fear, and guilt. And that's not what the discussion about white privilege is supposed to cause. It's supposed to cause those who do have the privilege to consider, how can I stop a system that is unjust? What can I do to help make it so others have opportunities that I've had? And what does it mean that if I'm silent and I don't actively get involved? And some of the ways that that can be done are discussed in the end of this chapter, and I'll mention it once we get to that section. But I do think that there is a key document that I'm going to share with the class by McIntosh. It's The Invisible Knapsack, and it's really important to understand that these invisible systems confer racial dominance on my group from birth. And so she is a white woman writing about her white privilege. And it's not about her feeling bad, oh, I've had all these privileges, I don't deserve this. It's about her understanding the invisible systems. She's giving name to the structures of power that have allowed her to advance and has denied other people the similar opportunities. And so what do you do with that information? What do you do as an individual? And then what do you do to contribute to a change in our system? That's the real question. And at the bottom of page 104, there's a really good catalog of 6 domains from that essay, from a list of originally 46, about what white privileges alleges for her as a white woman. And I think it's just really important to reflect on the things that we are able to do, or the things that we hear, or it's just, how do you become a social justice advocate or a racial justice advocate in light of this knowledge? What do you do with it? So it might be a really tough chapter for some of the scholars in our class to read, but I think it is a really important one because, as discussed on page 106, you really want to consider the psychological sense of belonging in a racist system, whether you consciously or not understand that. So you can unconsciously not understand that and be ignorant, or you can consciously start to realize that something's not right. And now what? Like, now what do you do? I really appreciated the end of this chapter. Students' responses to white privilege in Black studies classrooms. So it's about solidarity. It's about coming together, not alienating each other because of colorism or one person having experienced white privilege and another person hasn't. It's about seeing possibilities. And I was highlighting all over in this section. It goes from 108 to 110. And there's a point at the bottom of 108 that says, every student in a Black Studies classroom should have an avenue to join with their classmates to claim space as agents of progressive change. Everyone needs to recognize their life experiences and conditioned responses regarding racial privilege. Black students and other students of color cannot easily brush off the damage done socially and psychologically by white privilege, but they can seek strong, constructive responses that fit their era to help make the world and their communities whole. And so I think that, the key is that community, that coming together as a class, as you are all learning this, and understanding ways that you can make a difference in your future careers and within the system. So, for instance, I mentioned earlier that they discussed examples for how you can use this knowledge in your later work that actually makes a difference beyond individual interactions. And that's at the bottom of page 109. So they talk about, you might be a Black Studies graduate and you might go into a third grade classroom and become a school teacher. How do you impact the system with notions of stopping the pipeline to prison for Black children and youth based on the work that you do at that third grade level? What kinds of information are you sharing? What kinds of hope and dreams and mentorship? And because we don't ever do anything on our own, there's structures and systems in place that help communities to succeed. So what do you do as an instructor, as an educator at that level? And then they mentioned students who become bankers can fight the system within their role at the bank. How do you change policies to make loans approved on a fairer basis? Can you affect that paperwork or that process that's in place that make it difficult for some races over others to get a loan? And then, of course, there's community organizers, and of course, politicians. What is going on right now with voter suppression and racist immigration policies? If you go into a political field, you have huge impacts the way you represent your communities and the way you can consider equitable opportunities and equitable care and equitable access, right? So I just really loved that section. At the end of this chapter, there is a very hard story to read about the killing of Terrence Crutcher, and that starts on page 110. So content warning when you do get there. And just keep in mind that, and there's another supplemental video that I'm going to show you, that we have to really work on our unconscious or implicit biases that can affect the way we read people when we don't even realize that we're reading them a certain way. So there's a really good video I'm going to share about that. And if you need to know what implicit bias means, there is a great definition in the footnotes on page 116, note 37. And there's also a note on page 115, note 31 about the definition of microaggression. So I know I lectured a long time on white privilege because it's a very important chapter, so I'm going to be really brief with chapter 10, the Africana Studies and Oral History chapter, and that starts on 126. The key thing to understand here is the power of storytelling and the power of oral history and how it is rooted not only in African heritage and art and music and dance, but in a lot of different cultures and communities of color, indigenous, Mexican, Latina, Latino. Oral histories are just really powerful ways of sharing information generationally, and it's also a way of respecting our elders and the storytellers and their privileged role within a community. And I really like how they bring up the very specific African culture form of oral history with the Giro. It's spelled Griot. It's on page 128. And that is described as the individual who provides the genealogy of their community for the purpose of educating current and future generations about the history of their people. More specifically, Juros were considered to be dynamic and interactive historians who, unlike the Western conception of a historian, were responsible for linking the past, present, and future. And I love that Thomas Hale calls them time benders. There is power in not following a traditional chronological from past to present timeline on history. And what does it mean to time bend and to connect the past, present, and the future simultaneously as a storyteller? There's a lot of power of moving off a Eurocentric Western notion of understanding history. And so I think that that's just really, really powerful. And they give you some really good examples of oral history as methodology in terms of the profession in African American studies and Black studies. And they give you kind of like a case study here in terms of the Black Panther Party and the San Francisco 8. That starts on page 130. And again, when you get to this section, please note content warnings based on the information that is being shared, especially the oral history of Harold Taylor that starts at the bottom of page 131. There's nothing that can prepare you for what you read, even if you know the history. It's traumatizing. So just be aware of that when you get to that section. And I do think that oral history is a way of centralizing African voices and Black people's voices as holders of knowledge and as the subjects of their stories and their lives. And I mean, if we even think about some of the more recent ways that stories are being shared in terms of people videotaping with their phones when injustices are occurring or when Black bodies are being killed, there's power. There's power in being the holder of that story and that that knowledge and sharing it. And I think that one of the reasons oral history can be sometimes not encouraged within a dominant discipline is because it's another way of keeping communities and communities of color marginalized, as this isn't researchy enough, this isn't theoretical enough, this is the facts don't line up with what I know from the history books. There's ways to discredit our communities of color and their stories. And so I think that that's sometimes what a dominant um, discipline can do, unfortunately. But I do think that the link, it's at the bottom of page 134, and it's kind of where they end this chapter. It's the last paragraph. By creating a link between the Black Studies classroom and the oral histories of people from the community, we find that not only can learning be fun, but it can also be a process that facilitates the creation of a better tomorrow. At the very least, it guarantees that one more generation of scholars and lay people will be exposed to the histories of those people and movements that are often bypassed in many mainstream publications. So remember, the whole point and purpose of Black studies is Black liberation, it's Black power, it's Black freedom. It is a better tomorrow. It's about making our world better. And I think that oral history definitely provides an avenue in which more people can get connected and hear truth and experience empathy and experience the need to contribute, whether it be within the community, whether it be within one's own career, to make a difference and to take a stand and say, no more. I want something better for myself. I want something better for my friends, my families. And yeah, I mean, it's, if you've never done an oral history, you will have an opportunity coming up. So, with that in mind, if there are any questions, as always, please reach out to me via email. And I hope you enjoy these two chapters. Thank you.